What's up, guys? Doomwake here, and welcome back to another episode of Watching the Meta, the weekly series where we take a look at the metagame from the Magic Online challenges and perhaps very important paper events for Standard, Modern, and Pioneer. And we just take a look at the metagame, see if there's any big shifts, big changes as far as local tournaments that you may have coming up. It's a really good way for us to figure out what is happening within the metagame. Before we continue, as always, if you enjoy this type of content, consider subscribing to the channel. We are trying to make that big push towards 20,000 subscribers, but we need your help. So if you are not currently subscribed, please consider hitting that subscribe button and let me know in the comment section down below what you thought of the video. With all of that said, we are going to begin in the modern format. And as you can see here, I've actually included last week's graph, a bit smaller, so we can have a small scale. And then I want to mention that moving forward, it may look a little weird, the right-hand side. It's not in order of which archetype is the most played, because we're trying to keep the colors. So for example, Boros Energy, still the top deck in the format. You're probably not surprised to hear that. Last week, it was a whopping 27.3. This week, it's moved down to a more reasonable 17.2%. Belcher, still roughly in that 9 to 10% range. Mardu Energy took a little bit of an uptick here, 6.3 last week, 10.9 this week. One thing that's very, very surprising to me, Temur Eldrazi, 6.3% last week, nowhere to be found this week. I think there was only one, maybe two decks. Domain Zoo, about the same. Eldrazi Breach, about the same. Espergorios, roughly the same. Dimir Frogtide, taking a bit of a dip. Grinding Breach, from 3.1 to 6.3%. Ruby Storm, roughly the same. Jeskai Energy, which is a deck that we're going to be actually covering one of the deck lists here. It's distinctly different from Jeskai Control. Jeskai Energy is basically Boros splashing for a couple of blue cards. We'll talk about that in a second. Dimir Oculus 4.7, and then you kind of see the smaller metagame shares moving past that. So big surprises here. Boros took a huge drop, 27 to 17, but a lot of the Boros shares went towards other energy colors, specifically Mardu and Jeskai. So even though Boros went down 10%, that 10% kind of just went into other energy builds. So if you look at the energy core, 17.2, 10.9, and 5.7, that gets you roughly to about 32 to 33%. So energy is still the deck to beat. And let's take a look and see if we can maybe find some deck lists that have a good matchup against energy. So I mentioned we're trying to find some decks that can beat energy. Well, what if we just made the energy decks better? Oink Mage coming in here at 6th place. This is kind of where the first iteration of the Jeskai energy deck that I saw that did pick up in popularity. And this is what happens in the challenges where one deck does well on maybe a Friday and then more people pick that up for the Saturday and Sunday challenges. And I think that's exactly what happened here. What you see in front of you is effectively just Boros Energy, Ajani, Amped Raptor, Guide of Souls, Ocelot Pride. You're all used to these cards by now. A couple of Ragavans, but with a light blue splash for Expressive Iteration in the main deck and Consign to Memory in the sideboard. Those are two pretty big ones because Iteration, in theory, gives you a slight edge in the mirror because card advantage does matter a lot in mid-range mirrors. And then Consign helps a lot against the Eldrazi decks. It's just, Consign is such a good card. There's so many different decks that it's good against, and good against the One Ring as well. So makes a lot of sense. Maybe if you are interested in playing energy, this might be a good way to go. Now, as far as the non-energy decks are concerned, here is one from Power Nines who made top 8 on the 25th with Mono Red Eldrazi. I didn't really know what else to call this. Essentially, you have the big mana, Eldrazi Temple and Ugin's Labyrinth to accelerate out fast big plays, Devourer of Destiny to fix your hands, and then your Eldrazi are Linebreaker, which is a card we haven't seen in quite some time, Glaring Fleshraker, It That Heralds the End, Wayscape Battle Mage, couple of Null Drifters, and a couple of Sowing Myco spawns. So with the combination of Glaring Fleshraker and It That Heralds the End, you have Fleshraker to make a bunch of tokens, and then you have Heralds the End to pump up the tokens. So it allows you to go a little bit wider, which is pretty cool. And then Kozilek's Command, obviously, very, very good cards. A bit more of an aggressive take on Eldrazi, along with an Urza Saga package for Ghost Vacuum, Lava Spur Boots, Needle, Shadow Spear, and Springleaf Trump. So a lot of saga targets here, but just a bit of an interesting take on the Eldrazi archetype. Here's one that I wanted to showcase because it's a slightly different take on the Eldrazi Through the Breach decks, which you may have seen before, where we are playing this card, Yggdrasil Rebirth Engine, which is a card from Assassin's Creed. You can, when it enters, you exile all creature cards from your graveyard, and then you can pay 4 tap to put a creature card exiled with Yggdrasil onto the battlefield under your control. It gains haste. So essentially, if you have an Ulamog the Defiler in your graveyard, you play Yggdrasil, exile the Ulamog, and then the next turn, you have 4 mana. You can put that Ulamog into play and attack your opponent. You still have the Through the Breach plus Emrakul angle. You have Devourer of Destiny to fix your draws. Null Drifter as another card to pitch to Ugin's Labyrinth. So a lot of cool stuff going on here. Just a slightly different take on the Through the Breach decks. And then last but certainly not least, it wouldn't be a video showcasing Modern without an aspiring Spike Brew. So Selfie in 26th place has a mono blue Archway of Innovation Eldrazi deck where you're utilizing Tamiyo Meets the Story Circle to discard a bunch of cards and make a bunch of clue tokens. And then you're using those clue tokens to improvise out big Eldrazi, like Emrakul, like Ulamog. You can also utilize the clue tokens from Tamiyo to cast a fast Kappa Cannoneer, which is kind of interesting. Urza Lord High Artificer, also good with a bunch of artifacts. Makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of cool stuff going on here, so maybe a bit of an interesting take on, I guess this is a new archetype, but if you are interested in casting some big things, this might be a good way to do so. And then the last thing I wanted to mention, the challenges, there were 6 of them that we've covered here today. The 6 winners were 2 Grinding Breach, 1 Mono Blue Belcher, 1 Lotus Field combo, 1 Mardu Energy, and 1 Basking Broodscale combo. So a bit of an uptick there, but that is going to do it for Modern. Let's go over and see what's happening in Pioneer. So Pioneer is a bit of an interesting one here because this chart is a lot different than what we saw last week. So first and foremost, Rakdos Demons last week was the most played deck with a 13.8% metagame share. That has gone all the way down to 2.3%. So Demons, maybe a flash in the pan, maybe not. Maybe people are just moving to other archetypes. I will say that if you look at Rakdos Bloodletter 3.1%, the reason that those two are different is because Demons does not have the Bloodletter combo. Rakdos Bloodletter, as you could imagine, does have the Bloodletter combo. And there is still other Demons deck. There's Mono Black, I've seen some Orzhov, I've seen Golgari, so I've even seen Dimir, so plenty of Demons decks, maybe just in a different part of the metagame. Is it Phoenix? 14.1, 13.1 last week, so mostly the same. Mono Black, again, another big downtick, 11.3% last week, 3.9% this week. So whatever was in the water last week that was making people play Demons, it's no longer in the water this week. And then Rakdos Prowess, huge jump here, 10% last week, 18.8% this week. Modern Greasefang, roughly around the same at 7%. Company with a slight uptick. Again, Rakdos Bloodletter, slight downtick. And then you kind of see the rest there, Spirits. The 5-color Zur Overlords deck is gaining a little bit of traction, and they're actually becoming 80-card decks now. Last week, they were mostly 60 cards. This week, they're adding Yorion into the mix because Yorion works so well with the Overlords. That is kind of what the Pioneer metagame looks like. I will say, there were 4 challenges this week, and they were, maybe unsurprisingly, based on that graph, all won by Rakdos Prowess. So bit of a prowess metagame. But I mean, hey, if you find a deck that beats Rakdos Prowess, you can probably succeed in Pioneer right now. And then as far as decks we're going to look at, it's just 3 here, not a ton of innovation here, but there's a couple that I wanted to highlight. So first and foremost, I'm calling it Mono Red Osier. There was a couple of lists that people had played similar, and I think it's similar idea where somebody does well with the deck and people copy and play in the next challenges. That does happen quite a bit with the MTGO challenges. But this is a mono red deck that's utilizing Osier Axonil, which is basically if you deal an amount of non-combat damage, you deal damage equal to Osier's power instead of that non-combat damage. So works very well with stuff like Hired Claw, deal 1 damage, you deal them 4 instead. Chain Whirler, deal 4 to all of their creatures and 4 to them. Eidolon of the Great Revel, deal 4 to them. You get the idea. Ferocidon, they take 4. Needlehead, they take 4. So there's a lot of cool stuff that you can do with Osier in this deck. Kumano, anything like that. Leyline of Combustion, when they target your things, they take 4. So this is probably the best Osier deck I've ever seen. And to be honest with you, I'm curious as to why we're not playing 4. But yeah, a bit of a slightly different take on the mono red deck. A Xenowan here coming in 13th place. This is a Neoform but maybe not the Neoform that you're used to. So what we are doing here is we are playing Falaji Archaeologist, Picklock Prankster, and Thunder Trap Trainer. Note, those all happen to be 2-mana creatures. Neoform, when you sacrifice a creature, you can search for a creature card with converted mana cost equal to 1 plus the sacrifice creature. So normally, if you've seen Neoform in Pioneer, you'd be sacrificing Tasigur or Hooting Mandrills, going to get Atraxa. This is the fairest Neoform deck you've ever seen in your life. We're sacrificing a 2-drop just to get an Oculus because the card is that good. Some interaction here: Fatal Push, Bitter Triumph, Thoughtseize. I like No One Left Behind. This is pretty cool because it's a 5-mana card, but if you target a creature with mana value 3 or less, it costs 2 mana. So it's a 2-mana way to return Oculus from the graveyard to the battlefield, which is pretty cool because you can mill over Oculus with stuff like Falaji and Picklock Prankster. So a lot of cool stuff going on here, but it's just interesting to me that Oculus is powerful enough that we're just building our entire deck around it, but probably going to dodge those ley lines. And then the last deck that I wanted to go over here was a Orzhov Tokens deck by Achmid in 28th place. I've seen some Tokens decks in Pioneer that have been built around Carrot Cake, Enduring Innocence, and Caretaker's Talent. This one is a little bit different though, so we're utilizing the Cauldron Familiar plus Witch's Oven engine, and what's really interesting to me about Familiar plus Witch's Oven is 2 things. One, it is a way to put a creature onto the battlefield that triggers Enduring Innocence on your opponent's turn, and it's also a way to make a token on your opponent's turn to trigger the Caretaker's Talent, because when you sack the cat to the oven, you get a food token, that triggers Talon, and then when you sack the food to bring back the cat, that triggers Innocence, which draws you another card. So that whole engine sounds really, really cool. I've never seen anybody try it before, and this is the first time that I've seen that. So, I mean, maybe a good idea to put Oven Cat in your Enduring Innocence Caretaker's Talents decks if you are playing that in Pioneer. So just something to keep an eye on. All right, and last but certainly not least, we have quite possibly the most important format right now, Standard. So as we take a look at this graph here, there were 4 challenges, a Magic the Gathering Online Qualifier event, which is sort of like an RCQ, and the World Championship. So 6 total events that we're looking at here. So last week, Gruul Prowess, 17.2%, significant drop-off down to 7.8. That's a pretty big drop-off, especially for Prowess, because people did think this was the best deck for quite some time. Maybe it still is like one of the more powerful decks, but it is certainly not in terms of metagame share. Oculus, 12.5%, took another massive hit down to 6.3. Golgari midrange, 11.7 down to 3.1. And then you have Dimir midrange from 9.4 skyrocketing to 16.7. Jeskai Convoke taking a dip from 9.4 to 4.7. The Overlord's deck taking a slight dip, but nothing too crazy. And then another one that's very, very interesting here, Mono Red, almost doubling its metagame share from last week, which is partly due to the Standard Qualifier that may or may not have had 12 copies in the top 32, but we'll get to that in a second. Mono White tokens effectively just non-existent here, right? 4.7% last week, 0.5. I mean, 2 weeks ago, the Mono White tokens deck was all over the place, and now it's nowhere to be seen. Golgari Demons, 2.3% last week, 12% this week. Now, I will say a lot of this has to do with the World Championship results because we got all the deck lists on Friday. So the Saturday and Sunday challenges, along with the Sunday qualifier, were certainly impacted by the fact that we have the standard deck lists from the World Championships. So take this with a little bit of a grain of salt. Gruul Leyline, 0.8% last week, 6.3% this week. I think a lot of that has to do with JED just crushing people on day 1 with the Leyline deck, and then people picking it up for the Saturday and Sunday challenges. So you see a pattern here as to what's happening, you can sort of understand what's happening at the World Championships just by looking at this graph, which is kind of funny. Dimir Demons, nowhere to be found last week, 5.7% this week. Golgari Ramp didn't exist last week, 3.6% this week. That's Seth Manfield and co. Temur Prowess, that's the Sanctum deck from Worlds, 3.6%. So a lot of interesting stuff here. But I know you're all here for some deck lists, so let's go ahead and take a look at those. Let us start with a couple of decks not from the World Championships. The first one here is first place in, I believe, the Friday challenge from Lavunga21. And I have been playing a lot more of this deck recently because it is a blast. So what's going on here is you have Novice Inspector and Spyglass Siren, cheap ways to make artifacts that work with Zoetic Glyph. It's sort of like a 3 mana and soul artifact. And your cheap 1-drops also make 2 permanents for Warden of the Inner Sky and Regal Bunnicorn. So you have a little bit of synergy there. You have Steel Seraph, which is a card that if you have a giant Regal Bunnicorn in play, can gain you a lot of life or attack for a bunch of damage with flying. And then Mockingbird to tie the room together, where you can copy Bunnicorn and give it flying. You can copy your 1-drops to get more permanents for Warden of the Inner Sky. You can copy their stuff. I've copied so many Deep Cavern Bats with Mockingbird that I can't even count. And just a lot of cool stuff you can do. Sheltered by Ghosts gives you another good removal spell, and then a couple schooners and a hover ship rounding out the vehicles. So a lot of cool stuff going on here, and I think a deck that is utilizing its synergy very, very well. The other non-World Championship deck that I wanted to highlight here is from CCIE in 26th place. So for those of you who don't know, Foundations is bringing along with it Zombify, which is a 4-mana unconditional reanimation spell. Sort of similar to Rite of the Moth, but there's no finality counter, and it's only 3 and a black. And I think a deck like this is perfect for Zombify. Now, what I love about this deck so much is Splitskin Doll and Collector's Vault are artifacts that let you discard your large creature into the graveyard. Now, with your artifacts, even if you don't draw Rite of the Moth, you can then draw Beseech the Mirror to have something to bargain to go tutor for your Rite of Moth. So there's a lot of cool stuff going on here. Valgavoth's Faithful is another reanimation spell. And we call it the Splitskin Doll and the Vaults to discard, also Bitter Triumph to discard. Just a really, really cool deck list, and I think one that, with some tuning, could be potentially very, very powerful. Now let's get into a couple of World Championship decks. So the first one here, funny enough, if you'll notice here, this is actually the MTGO decklist format, and that's because CFD Sock was playing the World Championships on Friday and Saturday. This is the Sunday challenge. They said, you know what? I like my deck so much from Worlds that I'm going to play it in a challenge, and they crushed. So CFT Sock, this is the kind of breakout Teamer Prowess deck from the World Championships. And there's a lot of cool stuff going on here. So the basic combo is you're utilizing Enduring Vitality to make all of your creatures tap for mana with Valley Floodcaller, which says when you play a spell, untap your rats, otters, and so on and so forth, give them +1/+1. So you can imagine if you have, otters from Stormchaser's Talent, or just a Floodcaller or 2 in play, or a Thundertrap Trainer, you can start generating mana, and every time you're casting your 1-mana spells, like Stormchaser's Talent, like Torch the Tower, like Analyze the Pollen, Bushwhack, you have plenty of 1-mana spells, you can actually be generating mana. And eventually what you are trying to get to a point to is where you have Stormchaser's Talent and This Town Ain't Big Enough, where this town bounces your Stormchaser's Talent. It only costs 2 mana because you're targeting your own thing. That untaps a bunch of creatures. You replay the talent for 1 mana, presumably floating a couple from the other otters. Untap them again. Presumably that gives you 4 mana to then activate level 2 of the talent, which returns the This Town Ain't Big Enough. Cast it again, pick up your talent, untap your creatures, so on and so forth. You kind of get where that's going. The last thing I want to highlight here is Song of Totentans, which is a sick card because not only does it give you a bunch of bodies, the rats actually get untapped by Floodcaller, and most importantly, the song gives them haste, which means they can tap for mana the turn they come into play. So really, really sweet deck list here that was designed by the Sanctum team, and one that I'm probably going to have to spend some time on myself. We can't talk about the World Championships without talking about the world champion Javier Dominguez played this Dimir Demons deck. Now, if I remember vividly, I remember Javier saying that he actually didn't love his standard deck that much, and I want to say his record showed, but they came up with an interesting take on the Demons deck list. So a lot of what you see here is maybe what you're used to. Archfiend of the Dross, Unholy Annex, removal spells like Duress, Go for the Throat, Annoyant, all that kind of stuff. But they decided, instead of playing Bloodletter and Slasher, they decided to play Doomsday Excruciator, 2 copies, and Jace the Perfected Mind, 2 copies. The blue splash also gives you access to Fairy Mastermind, which gives you a slightly better counterspell than Phantom Interference in the form of Spell Stutter. So just some very, very small details there. At the end of the day, it is still an Unholy Annex deck I mean, this was the card of the tournament. This every single time this card came into play at the World Championships, the entire game revolved around it, and just a fantastic card. If you're playing Standard right now, you probably need to have a plan for this card. The next deck I wanted to take a look at here is Seth Manfield and Co.'s Golgari Ramp deck. So what's interesting to me about this Golgari deck is some stuff that you're probably used to, right? Glissa Sunslayer, Shieldred the Apocalypse, all the interaction, Duress, Go for the Throne, Anoint, Terra Sunder, Cut Down. You're all used to that stuff. But this team decided that they wanted to make their Golgari deck a little bit bigger, and they actually included 4 Overlord of the Hauntwoods and 4 Up the Beanstalk. What I like about this is you have Harvester of Misery and Virtue of Persistence, both of which act as 2 mana removal spells, but later in the game, if you have a Beanstalk or 2 in play, they can actually trigger the Beanstalk if you've gotten to that much mana, which is kind of cool. They're playing a couple of sweepers in the form of 2 Cover-Up and 1 Gix's Command in the main. They're also playing an Outrageous Robbery in the main deck, which I like because early on, if you need to just do it for 2 to hit some land drops, that's fine. Later in the game, even only on 5 mana, it still triggers Beanstalk, so there's some cool stuff going on there. So maybe an interesting take on Golgari to help kind of fight the other mid-range matchups and potentially go over the top in the... I wouldn't say go over the top in the domain matchup because they still probably go over the top of you, but just a good way to gain an edge in the other mid-range matchups. And then last but certainly not least, this is kind of the deck that took the MTGO metagame by storm this weekend. This is Quinn Tanole's mono red deck. Very, very straightforward. All 4 ofs. I kind of wish Quinn had cut the 21st land for the 4th Frenzy just so we could have the full 4 of experience, but here we are. What's very, very interesting to me about Quinn's mono red deck is the introduction of Screaming Nemesis. And if you look at the creatures, I don't see any Slickshot show-offs. Where'd that card go? And I think that is a conscious decision because Slickshot show-off is significantly worse if you expect a lot of mono red mirrors. Cards does not block very well. It dies to a lot of stuff. The fake prowess on it doesn't pump toughness, so you can't even save it from most removal spells. So I understand if you're expecting a lot of red decks to cut the Slick Shots, and they probably did expect a lot of red decks, which makes sense. And Screaming Nemesis is absurd in red mirror matches because every single time they trade with this card, you are going to be up in the exchange. If they have a removal spell on it, it's going to be damage-based, which means you get to kill one of their creatures. And if they trade in combat, you're trading for a creature, and you're killing another creature with it. So, phenomenal card in the red mirrors, and I think it makes a lot of sense to play that. Maxing on the Mice plan, 4 Manifold, 4 Challenger, and 4 Heartfire Hero. Hired Claw, Shock, Rage, Strike, 3 Frenzy. There's also a really cool line where you can go attack, and then post-combat, Frenzy your own Nemesis to just deal your opponent 5 damage. That comes up quite a bit. And then in the sideboard, maxing on Torch for the mirror matches, Forges for Golgari, Barrages, Twisted Fealty for the Archfiend decks. Just a very, very well-built deck by Quinn. And this one is probably here to stay alongside a lot of the other Worlds decks. And that is going to do it for another episode of Watching the Meta. If you enjoyed this type of video, again, please consider subscribing to the channel. Let me know what you thought in the comment section down below. And until next week, adios.